Imagine a world where Nazi Germany, not the United States, won the atomic race. How long would it have taken them to develop their first atomic bomb? Who would have been responsible? And what kind of devastation would it have unleashed? In our real history, the Manhattan Project led the research on atomic weapons, ultimately ending World War II with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These attacks forced Japan to surrender and secured victory for the Allied powers. But what if history had unfolded differently? What if Germany had won the nuclear race instead? In this video, we'll explore an alternate reality where Nazi Germany, rather than the Allies, produced and used the first atomic bomb. How would this have shifted the course of the war? Would the Allies have surrendered to Germany? And how would the world look today if this had happened? We'll dive into the science behind the nuclear race, the military strategies that led the Allies to victory, and the long-term consequences of a German nuclear triumph. But before we dive into this scenario, let's first understand what happened in our actual timeline. The competition to build the first atomic bomb wasn't just a military race. It was also a scientific battle that had been brewing for over 15 years before the first explosion. While the Manhattan Project, with J. Robert Oppenheimer as its lead scientist, is often credited with winning the race, Germany wasn't far behind. In fact, under different circumstances, they could have been just weeks away from producing this terrifying weapon first. What held Germany back from winning the nuclear race? Several key factors, including disorganization among scientists, a lack of resources, and strategic errors, prevented them from reaching the same breakthrough as the Allies. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to imagine a world where those obstacles never existed. What if Germany wasn't held back? What if they had become the first major power to gain control of nuclear weapons? In the next few minutes, we'll dive into this dark alternate history where the Nazis succeed in creating the atomic bomb. We'll explore the possible horrors they could have unleashed and the chilling implications for the world today if the Nazis had used the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Stay tuned as we take a look into this unsettling scenario and consider how different our world might have been if Germany had emerged victorious in the nuclear arms race. The nuclear arms race between the Allies and the Axis powers during the Second World War was one of the most critical battles in recent history. At its core, it wasn't just a race to build a weapon of mass destruction. It was a race to control atomic energy, a concept that had emerged in the scientific world long before the World War. The second experiments aimed at controlling atomic energy began in 1933 with Mark Oliphant, who accelerated proton particles to strike a target with energies exceeding 600,000 electron volts. The Manhattan Project, led by the United States with help from Great Britain and Canada, was the first serious attempt to produce nuclear bombs. However, what is less well known is that Germany, under Adolf Hitler's leadership, also sought to develop nuclear weapons, and for a time, they were ahead of the Allied powers in the atomic field. The Third Reich's project was called Uranverein, or the Uranium Club. It started around the same time the Manhattan Project began conducting its research. The Uranium Club had some of the world's most brilliant physicists working on it, including Werner Heisenberg, yes, the namesake of Walter White's alias, Otto Hahn, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. From 1939 to 1944, they worked on uncovering the secrets of nuclear power and fusion. However, several factors slowed Germany's progress in the nuclear race. One of the biggest problems was the lack of coordination between the German scientists. While all Manhattan Project scientists worked together under one roof and were a top priority for the US government, receiving massive funding, Hitler lost faith in nuclear power around 1942. He cut the project's funding by nearly 80%, which significantly hindered progress. This disorganization, combined with material shortages as the war dragged on, greatly slowed down the German effort. Another major reason for Germany's failure was a misunderstanding of the necessary technology. The German scientists were unfamiliar with some of the tools required to calculate how much radioactive material was needed for a bomb. This led them to miscalculate the amount of uranium and plutonium necessary, causing them to prematurely dismiss the feasibility of developing a bomb in a reasonable time. In contrast, the scientists working on the Manhattan Project, including famous names like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi, correctly calculated and understood the means to make an atomic bomb. The Allies also deliberately sabotaged Germany's infrastructure, critical to its nuclear efforts. A key moment came in 1943 when British bombers destroyed a heavy water plant in Norway that was crucial to Germany's attempt to build a nuclear reactor. This bombing operation nearly wiped out all of the research that had been done up to that point. The combination of scientific missteps, sabotage by the Allies, and resource shortages left Germany far behind in the nuclear race. But what if all this hadn't happened? Imagine what the German scientists could have achieved if they had received more resources and their research hadn't been hampered by the Allied forces. It's not unreasonable to think that, under different circumstances, Germany could have won the nuclear race and changed the entire course of the war. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this alternate timeline could have played out. If Germany had succeeded, how would they have used the bomb, and what would have been the immediate consequences for Europe and the wider world? Now let's dive into this alternate timeline, a timeline where Germany succeeds in developing the first atomic bomb. Imagine it's 1945, and after years of intense research, the members of the Uranium Club, led by Werner Heisenberg, have finally produced a functioning nuclear weapon. In this version of history, the Uranium Club was far better organized and well-funded, as Hitler never lost faith in the potential of nuclear energy and the scientists behind the project. And now they have a working atomic bomb, and they are not hesitant to use it. The first question that comes to mind is, how would Germany have used this weapon of mass destruction? Given Hitler's aggressive military strategies, it's unlikely he would have hesitated to deploy this weapon. There are several potential targets they could have struck first: London, Moscow, or even New York. For this scenario, we'll focus on London. Germany drops the atomic bomb on London, causing unprecedented devastation. The city is instantly reduced to rubble, with a psychological impact on the Allied forces that is almost as severe as the physical destruction. The sheer scale of the damage and the speed with which London is wiped out sends shockwaves across the globe, striking fear into the hearts of the Allied leadership. This single strike alters the course of the war. The Allies now face an enemy capable of annihilating entire cities with a single bomb. Fear grips the leadership in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union as they realize that they are not equipped to counter such a weapon. This forces them to pause their advances, particularly American and Soviet troops closing in on Germany, and rethink their strategies entirely. At this point, Germany would likely issue ultimatums to the Allied forces. The Allies, fearing the potential destruction of their own cities, would be forced to negotiate. The prospect of New York, Moscow, or Washington, D.C. suffering the same fate as London would push the Allies into a precarious position where they must consider terms dictated by Nazi Germany. Another possible course of action for Germany would be to use the bomb to end the war on the Eastern Front. A nuclear strike on a city like Moscow or Leningrad could shatter Soviet resistance, allowing Germany to focus its full power on the Western Front. This could potentially push the British and Americans out of occupied territory, further solidifying Germany's control over Western Europe. Under the constant threat of further nuclear attacks, all Allied forces might be forced to withdraw from Europe, leaving the continent under Nazi rule. For the United States, this situation would present a grave dilemma. Should they continue their research into developing nuclear bombs, knowing that Germany now has the capability to retaliate by destroying American cities? Or should they capitulate to Nazi Germany's ultimatum, preserving their safety in the short term, but allowing Germany to dominate Europe? As we can see, the global power dynamics would be fundamentally altered, with Germany emerging as the dominant superpower, followed by Japan and the other Axis powers. The United States and Soviet Union would be reduced to secondary roles, operating under the shadow of a Nazi-controlled Europe. This alternate timeline paints a grim picture of what could have been. The damage Nazi Germany could have inflicted with atomic bombs goes far beyond just the destruction of London. The world would have been reshaped in unimaginable ways. In the next chapter, we will explore the long-term consequences of a Nazi nuclear victory. Stay tuned. Immediately after Germany successfully nuked London, the political landscape would have shifted dramatically in favor of the Axis powers. The Allies were forced to confront a reality that had seemed impossible only days before the bomb was dropped. The most devastating blow was not just the physical destruction, but the overwhelming psychological impact that reverberated across the Allied nations. Morale, both in the military and on the home front, would have been shattered. Civilians, gripped by fear, would live in constant terror, knowing that entire cities could vanish in the blink of an eye. Political pressure within the Allied nations would escalate rapidly. In Britain, the total destruction of London would almost certainly lead to capitulation. Winston Churchill, who famously resisted any suggestion of surrender, might have been killed in the nuclear blast or removed from power by those who sought an end to the devastation. In this scenario, a new leader would likely rise to negotiate Britain's surrender to the Axis forces. Given the circumstances, Britain's ability to continue the fight would be non-existent, making capitulation a near certainty. On the Eastern Front, the situation would be equally dire for Stalin. The Soviet Union had already suffered immense losses, and while the Red Army was formidable, the psychological impact of a nuclear strike on Moscow or Leningrad would cripple Soviet morale. Even Stalin, known for his ruthless determination, would be faced with an impossible choice: negotiate a peace settlement with Nazi Germany or risk the annihilation of his cities and people. In this timeline, the Soviet forces might retreat deep into Russian territory, potentially abandoning large portions of land, including Ukraine, in an effort to preserve what remained of the Soviet Union. Germany's use of nuclear weapons would have halted any Allied plans to invade Europe or recapture Axis-held territories. The battles that eventually led to Germany's downfall in our timeline likely would never occur, as all Allied forces would be too terrified of a nuclear retaliation to launch any significant offensive against German-held ground. This would give Nazi Germany the time it needed to rebuild its military and fortify its defenses. With a rebuilt army and nuclear deterrent, Germany would be poised to execute its Endsieg, or final victory plan, likely stretching from 1947 to 1950. In this grim, alternate timeline, the Axis powers would reign supreme, and the world would be forced to accept the reality of a nuclear-armed Nazi Germany. The long-term consequences would be devastating for the balance of global power and for humanity as a whole. As we reflect on this alternate history that, thankfully, never came to pass, one thing is clear: if Germany had won the nuclear race, the world we live in today would be unrecognizable. The stakes of the Second World War were already incredibly high, but the introduction of nuclear weapons would have escalated the conflict to an unimaginable level. The implications for civilians are chilling to consider. In this timeline, Nazi Germany's possession of atomic bombs would have shifted the global power dynamic, allowing the Third Reich to emerge as the dominant world power. The immediate destruction of cities like London or Moscow would have forced the Allies into peace negotiations, or worse, outright capitulation. This would have enabled the Third Reich to expand even further, likely transforming it into the largest empire on Earth. If Germany had continued its conquest, the Third Reich could have stretched across vast swaths of Europe and Asia, creating a totalitarian regime that ruled much of the world. In this alternate reality, the expansion of Nazi Germany, fueled by its nuclear dominance, would have reshaped global politics, economics, and society. The world would have been plunged into an era of fear and repression, with the Third Reich at the center of it all. Thankfully, history did not unfold this way, but the mere thought of what could have been serves as a stark reminder of the dangers nuclear weapons posed, and still pose, to humanity. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Bye.